Wow! Oh my god! How long have I done a video like this? Probably too long. Apologies for the state of my bed. Apparently I've got enough time to write a full-on video essay, but I don't have enough time to clean my bed. A while ago, I posted an edit from a comic strip called Power Up, but I edited it to say, what's your opinion on politics and art? As far as I'm concerned, all art is inherently political. And you know, that was pretty funny, you know. I thought it was pretty funny, you know, it was a shit post. It wasn't very serious, I didn't take it very seriously. A lot of people got very, very mad about it, which I found a little funny and a little strange. With one person even saying, and I've written it down here, anyone who believes this uncritically is a dangerous moron, worthy of scorn. Hooah. Strong words. Now, I can understand why people don't necessarily like the phrase, art is inherently political. You know, it's a bit of a loaded phrase, if anything. When you say art is inherently political, does that mean everything has to be a statement? Does that mean, you know, what about the abstract shit? Is that inherently political? What the fuck? Why does the woke want to put all these politics in my art? Why the woke? Why the liberals? But I think this is a bit of a misunderstanding, and that's fair enough, right? Because it's a bit of a misleading phrase, if anything. When people say art is inherently political, or at least art being political, people think, oh, it's got like, you know, standard depictions of political figures or like political allegories. Something along the lines of like, you know, I guess Metal Gear Solid or like Bioshock would somewhat fit that, where it's like very overtly about politics. I think there's a lot more to just that, right? I think art being political refers to the idea that someone's art, anyone's art, doesn't matter what it is shaped by the political ideas, beliefs, ideologies, etc. that surround them, whether or not it is intentional, right? Some art is more overtly political, like I just mentioned, that's fine. I don't think One Piece would he ever be considered unpolitical. That seems a bit strange to call a piece of art unpolitical, you know? So I'm going to talk a little bit in this video about some, you know, pieces of art that I know, that I'm aware of, that sort of share this sentiment, or that I think show the sentiment really well. I'm not a genius, I'm not a big art scholar guy. If you want a decent video on the explanation of art being inherently political, watch Jacob Geller's vid. He goes into a lot more pieces of art than I do, a lot more interesting pieces of art than I do, and it's overall very much more well made than this video is. Lots of art is just a reflection of the environment that they grew from. They're a reflection of the values and the context that they inhabit, right? So first example. Godzilla, he's the big fucking lizard, and he spits fire out of his fucking mouth. That's nuts. Holy fuck! One could watch the original Godzilla without acknowledging what he actually represents. Is Godzilla political at surface level? No, it's about, you know, a group of people trying to survive Godzilla. It's about the interconnectional relationships between those people. Is Godzilla a character rooted in national trauma and anxiety over new technologies that were at the time? Absolutely. Kimi Honda said, who is the wife of the director, said without the bomb they could not have been a monster. So Godzilla came out roughly 9 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were both blown away by the atomic bombs that were developed by America. And so it sort of represents this, you know, the trauma of a nation. I think Godzilla as a character sort of reflects how many Japanese people viewed the atomic bomb at that time. And Jun Fukuda even says Godzilla was an embodiment of violence and hatred for mankind. So if that's how Japanese people viewed the atomic bomb, and that's how they interpreted it, as this big, uncaring, destructive monster, gee whiz, that feels a little bit heavy, doesn't it? With Japan being economically and spiritually crushed, it's no wonder that Godzilla is the way it was. In fact, I believe it was supposed to represent a mushroom cloud. So the allegory would have been more prevalent in the original. If Godzilla is a reflection of the environment that it was created, what is an art piece that is an inherent reaction to its environment. Most art movements, anyway, are reactions to their previous art movements. They're either criticizing it by doing something different. I'm not a big art genius. I'm looking at it through like a pop culture standpoint. And this is a British album, a British pop album. Oh! And I don't know about you, but they're losing the pulsing. Yes, yes. About 1992, there's an English band called Blur, and they're touring the US at the moment, and they're not really happy about it. They're a bit sick of it. They're a bit homesick even. So, as a reaction to the burgeoning grunge scene, out of this reaction, and the supposed Americanization of the UK, because Damon Albarn was so scared of Britain losing all of its culture, came about Modern Life is Rubbish, which was a collection of very, very British songs, which is half sort of wallowing in the many, many British sounds and artists that came before it, so like the Kinks and the XTC, while also criticizing, you know, British life at that point, which was rubbish, I guess. I can only assume it was rubbish. I don't know why else they would have called the album that. So, grunge was a reflection of where a lot of young American people sort of stood at that point, post-Reagan and post-AIDS crisis, you could say as well. Social alienation, recession, the Modern Life and Rubbish in comparison to a grunge album like Nevermind, which is very slow, very nihilist in a sense. It's very much brighter in tone. It's very tongue-in-cheek. There's social commentary in both albums, but Modern Life is Rubbish does it in a very bright, upbeat sort of way. It's like, haha, look at this guy, that's crazy. Wow. You know, there's a lot more humor and there's a lot more snark that's present in Modern Life is Rubbish, and you can see that in a song like Sunday Sunday, which is about how fucking boring Sundays are in England. You can see that in Getting Lost on the Westway. There's a guy getting sick and a girl has to drive her around. You know, and adverts for holidays. You know, being stuck in the work week, being absolutely drained by it, and seeing an ad for a holiday on the train home. That sort of thing. Much of Modern Life is Rubbish identity is formed around Blur's very disdainful reaction towards grunge, and Modern Life is Rubbish represented a very specific point in British music that wasn't just the album that was, you know, angry about where American music was going, but I feel like the Britpop movement, which is lastly, you know, very, very, very based in English tradition, English music, English ideas, etc. It was very anti-American, it was very pro-UK. And from the genre known as Britpop came Cool Britannia, which was this massive, you know, wave of pro-British sentiment. So Modern Life is Rubbish was a reaction to a specific social economic environment, and it would just so happen to shape its own political environment. Does that make sense? I'm hoping this is making sense. I really hate if I got 30 minutes of footage and none of it made sense at all. So, we have a piece of art that's a reflection of socio-political values. We have a piece of art that was a reaction to specific social political values. So what is a piece of art that's simultaneously a reflection and a reaction to its social political environment look like? Answer: pro wrestling, baby. We're back. Did you really think you'd get on this channel and you wouldn't hear me talk about professional wrestling in some way? Why would you even think that, dummy? Pro wrestling's a very good example of what many people would, you know, call low art in comparison to something like high art, you know, on that Theodore Adorno shit. Wrestling's always sort of been political, I would argue, you know, and especially post-Cold War, it was very overt. You know, you had guys like Nikolai Volkov and fucking the Iron Sheik, Sheiky baby, Haptor, and they would be portrayed as the bad guys, and then, you know, the all-American heroes would be portrayed as the good guys, brother. And even so, like, you know, you've got people like Cody Rhodes now who have done two big fucking promos on how great America is to British people. Wow, we all love you, Cody Rhodes. You're truly an American patriot. Those are sort of standard depictions, right? That's the standard definition I talked about earlier. This is we're gonna get a little bit deeper, right? We're gonna talk about the fucking attitude era, baby. This isn't for kids. This is for big boys. supposedly. The Attitude Era was developed simultaneously as a reaction to the WWS composition, WCW, and especially ECW, which were, getting into very, adult territory, you could say, edgier. You had the NWO, and then you had literally everything that was happening in ECW. Anything that happened in ECW could be considered adult. But it was also a reflection of where American tastes were sort of headed at that time, heading into the 21st century. The Attitude Era was grimier, it was edgier, it was geared for, young adults rather than children and families, because people wanted something raw. They wanted something raw, like Monday Night Raw. So pro wrestling, in the sense, in a postmodern sort of way, began to revel in its own fictionality. Pro wrestling up until that point was sort of like, no, we're real. See, it treated itself as very much a actual sport competition. But then pro wrestling, Attitude Era, began to sort of revel in the fact that it was a fictional show. Rather than be influenced by, traditional soap operas, it began to, take influence from stuff like the Jerry Springer Show. And wrestling began to feel a lot more personal. There were a lot more personal stakes in it. You had Kane and Undertaker. You had the Hart brothers, I guess. It was more of a reflection of where the United States stood on the cusp of the 21st century. Most of wrestling is based off, foreign adversaries, right? Or at least that's how it was in the 70s and 80s. With the dissolvement of the USSR, America didn't really have anyone to fight. So it just sort of began to look in on itself and criticize itself, right? And Attitude Era wrestling began to do the same thing. You had guys like Vince McMahon, who was the boss of the WWF, and you had him fucking beat up people and force people to do his bidding, his fucked up bidding, which wasn't too far off from how he actually treated his employees. As Paul A. Cantor talks about in his article Pro Wrestling and the End of History, traditional notions of morality, heroism, and patriotism were eroded, so to speak, and wrestling turned to new sources to hold the interest of the fans. And obviously, you had one of the most famous rivals. You had Vince McMahon and Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was not just good guy versus bad guy. It was a full-on class war. Stone Cold Steve Austin was this working class hero, and Vince McMahon was, the antithesis. He was this upper class evil boss. It was no longer, fixed. Good guys and bad guys in wrestling were no longer fixed. They exemplified this postmodern idea that human identity is purely a construction, a matter of choice, and not nature. Stone Cold is not necessarily the ethically best hero. He would fucking just come out and spray people with beer all the time. He's not necessarily the best guy, but his intentions are clear, and I think that's what matters, right? The Attitude Era embodied a very specific time in American pop culture. It was both a reaction to alternatives in wrestling, and it was a reflection of how Americans interpreted their environment leading up to Y2K. Especially, the Clinton trial. People did not particularly trust the people in power. And I think that's where Vince McMahon sort of tapped into. Or at least that's what Vince McMahon tapped into. He tapped into the idea that people did not particularly like their bosses or anyone in power, and he portrayed himself as this dickhead boss, which is what he was like anyway. And through this idea, pro wrestling, which you wouldn't necessarily call political, it becomes inherently political by this mix match of ideas. Who would have fucking thought? Who would have thought that this art form would be inherently political, whether or not it was actually portraying politically fueled ideas? Who would have thunk? What's the point then? What's the point of this video? This is purely defending the argument that art is inherently political, because it is, right? Anytime you see a show or a movie or a piece of art, anything that is a piece of art. TV is art, films are art, video games are art. Anything and anything could be art if you look hard enough, really. It's always going to have some level of depth to it. It's not always, it's not that deep. That's a stupid way of thinking, right? Because it's never as shallow as you think it is. Because there's always an element of deeper meaning within it. And some of that, has to do with, with politics. Whether you like it or not, art will be inherently political. That's what I think anyway. If you disagree, that's fine. You know, you can talk about it if you've got something to say, talk about it in the comments. If you disagree, put a comment. It helps. It helps with my analytics. That's sort of where I want to end off here. Is that I think art is inherently political, and this whole video has been a defense of such, with a bunch of case studies to go along with it. So yeah, like and sub. I'll see you whenever.